You don't realize what was real until it's gone. And by the time you do, it's already too late. Let me tell you something that might hurt, but it's the truth. The moment someone who deeply loved you, truly saw you, believed in your mess and your magic, finally walks away, it's not quiet. It's not clean. It's not something you forget over time. It's the kind of realization that grabs you by the throat at 2 a.m. when your phone doesn't light up anymore, when their name no longer shows up on your screen. You thought they'd always be there, didn't you? That you could pull back, disconnect, shut down, because you believed love would just wait for you to figure it out. But love doesn't beg forever. And this is the moment avoidants realize they didn't lose someone ordinary. They lost someone rare, someone who loved them, not despite their walls, but through them. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear may just be the emotional wake-up call you didn't know you needed. When we talk about love, we often imagine this grand, poetic force that conquers all. But here's the reality that most people refuse to accept. Love can't be the only one doing the work. It doesn't matter how deep someone's feelings are for you. If the love isn't mutual in effort, not just emotion, it's going to crack. Love isn't just a feeling, it's a choice. It's a daily practice. It's vulnerability, commitment, presence, communication. And when one person in a relationship carries the weight of emotional labor, tries to initiate every conversation, hold space for every shutdown, and is constantly left wondering where they stand, they begin to burn out, slowly, then all at once. You see, the one who loves harder, gives more, checks in constantly, and tries to read between your silences doesn't just get tired. They start to feel invisible. They start to question their worth, not because they don't believe in their value, but because they're trapped in a connection that mirrors a one-way street. That's not partnership. That's endurance. That's survival disguised as love. Love can't be the one apologizing for every emotional outburst, the one making peace after every conflict, the one adjusting their tone, their timing, their entire emotional ecosystem just to not upset you. If love is constantly negotiating its existence around your moods, your detachment, your fear of closeness, it becomes conditional. And that's the antithesis of what real love is supposed to be. Love thrives in safety and reciprocity. And when one person is forced to be both the flame and the fuel, they start running on fumes. They become the overthinker, the fixer, the empath who believes if they just love harder, the other person will finally feel safe enough to show up. But here's the truth. No one tells them. The more you overcompensate, the more the imbalance grows. You're not saving the relationship. You're delaying its inevitable collapse. Because at the end of the day, love cannot be sustainable if only one person is committed to its growth. When love is one-sided in effort, it begins to morph into something unrecognizable. What once felt like a nurturing connection becomes a task list of emotional to-dos. The loving partner starts to manage the moods, tiptoe around triggers, decode vague texts, and act like an emotional translator for someone who refuses to communicate openly. They stop expressing their own needs because they've been conditioned to believe that doing so might cause a shutdown or worse, abandonment. And little by little, they lose themselves. They become quieter, less expressive, more anxious. They shrink, not because they want to, but because they think it's the only way to keep the relationship alive. And here's where the dangerous illusion happens. The avoidant partner mistakes this silence for peace, for contentment, for stability, but what they don't realize is that the quiet isn't love. It's exhaustion. It's resignation. It's someone loving you so much they're willing to disappear just to keep you close. And while you think you've avoided confrontation, avoided vulnerability, avoided the discomfort of intimacy, what you've actually done is destroy the very thing you thought would wait for you. Love is not your caretaker. Love is not your emotional punching bag. Love is not meant to constantly prove itself to you while you remain distant and indifferent. The person who loved you wasn't asking for a fairy tale. They weren't asking for perfection. They were asking for presence, for consistency, for a partner. And instead, they became your emotional crutch, the one always reaching while you kept retreating. It might not have looked cruel on the surface, but emotionally, it left scars. Because it hurts more to feel alone in a relationship than it does to be alone outside of one. The saddest part? When that love finally leaves, you don't lose someone weak. You lose someone strong enough to keep choosing you through your silence, through your fear, through your inconsistencies. And by the time you realize they were the only one doing the work, it's already too late. You're left with the echo of their love, their loyalty, their patience, and a painful awareness that what you lost wasn't just a person, but the version of yourself they believed could grow if only you had chosen to meet them halfway. Avoidance is often misunderstood. It masquerades as strength, as independence, as control. It convinces you that pulling away is safer than leaning in, that silence is preferable to vulnerability, and that distance protects you from disappointment. But what avoidance actually does is isolate you. It creates an illusion of safety by building walls so high no one can get through, including you. You end up trapped behind the very defenses you constructed to keep yourself from feeling abandoned, hurt, or exposed. It feels like self-preservation, but in truth, it's slow emotional starvation. When you avoid connection, you don't avoid pain, you delay it, and when it comes, it arrives in heavier, lonelier waves. You might believe you're protecting your heart, but what you're doing is denying yourself the very thing your heart needs to heal: intimacy, closeness, belonging. Avoidance isn't peace. It's emotional paralysis. It's pretending you're okay with surface-level interactions when your soul is screaming for someone to understand you. It's showing up halfway in relationships because you fear being seen too clearly, yet aching in silence when people walk away because they never truly knew you. It's convincing yourself that solitude is your preference, when in reality, it's become your punishment. You say you value your space, your freedom, your independence, and that may be true, but avoidance isn't about those things. Avoidance is about fear. The fear of needing someone, the fear of depending on someone and being disappointed, the fear of showing your emotional cards and having them discarded. So you keep the world at arm's length. You engage just enough to not feel completely alone, but never enough to risk being hurt. And while that might protect you from heartbreak temporarily, it also shields you from love, growth, and meaningful connection. People who struggle with avoidance are often incredibly emotionally intelligent. They can read a room, anticipate needs, and keep conversations pleasant, but they rarely let the mask slip. They rarely say what they're truly feeling. And when they do, it's calculated, measured, controlled. Vulnerability feels like exposure, and exposure feels like danger. So rather than risk the discomfort of emotional closeness, they default to detachment. But what they don't see is that the people around them start to feel rejected, unseen, unnecessary. When you consistently withdraw, people stop reaching. When you give nothing, people assume you want nothing. And the ones who once loved you deeply start to question their own worth, not because they aren't valuable, but because your avoidance made them feel like they weren't welcome in your world. You think you're sparing others from your chaos, but what you're really doing is making them feel shut out from your reality. Avoidance convinces you that you're in control, that you're calling the shots. But the truth is, avoidance controls you. It dictates how deeply you can connect, how long relationships last, how intimate conversations go. It convinces you to sabotage something beautiful before it becomes threatening. You begin to misinterpret care as pressure, love as obligation, and emotional closeness as suffocation. So you pull away, not because the other person did something wrong, but because the intimacy feels overwhelming. You tell yourself you're better off alone, but the loneliness starts to seep through your everyday moments. In crowded rooms, in quiet nights, in the way no one really knows how your day was or what's heavy on your heart. You become a stranger to connection, and worse, a stranger to yourself. And maybe, just maybe, it all began with a wound, a moment in your past that taught you people leave, that love doesn't last, that closeness means eventual pain. So you adapted, you built a fortress, and for a while it worked. But what worked for your survival is now costing you your ability to thrive. Because life isn't just about getting through, it's about being fully alive. And that includes emotional risk. That includes letting people in. That includes understanding that heartbreak, while painful, is not fatal, but disconnection over time is. You start to shrink in your own life. Your relationships become shallow. Your friendships feel distant. And even in love, you feel unseen because you refuse to be seen. Avoidance might have kept you safe, but it also kept you small. It gave you control, but it robbed you of depth. It helped you escape the chaos of vulnerability, but it left you isolated in the quiet of your own defenses. You wanted freedom, but what you got was emotional solitude. Because the truth is, you cannot selectively numb feelings. When you numb fear, you numb joy. When you shut out pain, you shut out love. And when you avoid the risk of connection, you also avoid the reward, being truly, deeply, unapologetically known. Avoidance often wears a clever disguise. It looks like strength, sounds like independence, and even feels like control. But under the surface, it's not empowerment. It's fear. It's a deeply rooted defense mechanism that convinces you stepping back is smarter than leaning in, that silence is safer than honesty, that pushing people away is more manageable than watching them walk away on their own. Avoidance tells you that if you don't get too close, you won't get hurt. But what it doesn't tell you is that in the process of dodging the pain, you begin to starve your heart of what it actually needs the most: connection, intimacy, and emotional closeness. You're not protecting yourself, you're cutting yourself off. You're not creating space, you're building a prison. And the worst part? You may not even notice it until it's too late, until the people who once fought to love you are no longer knocking at the door you closed. There's a story you tell yourself when you're avoidant. You say you're just not good at emotions, that you don't want to be a burden, or that you're just better on your own. These phrases become your armor, the walls you use to rationalize detachment. But if you were honest, truly painfully honest, you'd realize that behind every withdrawal is a fear of being seen, rejected, or abandoned. You push people away, not because you don't want love, but because deep down you don't believe you're equipped to handle the vulnerability it requires. So you default to what feels safe: distance. You ghost instead of communicate. You deflect with sarcasm instead of expressing how you feel. You say, "I'm fine," when your heart is aching. And slowly, the people in your life stop trying to peel back your layers, not because they don't care, but because they've learned you won't let them in. Avoidance is lonely. Even in a crowded room, you can feel completely disconnected. Even when someone loves you fiercely, you still feel unsure, unsafe, unworthy. That's because you've trained yourself to view closeness as danger. You might even sabotage good relationships because you can't trust the feeling of being seen. You mistake stability for boredom, intimacy for pressure, emotional depth for suffocation. And so you run, sometimes quietly, sometimes abruptly. You retreat into yourself and tell people you just need space, when what you really need is healing. You convince yourself that needing others is weakness. Yet at night, you lie awake wondering why no one truly understands you. That's the paradox of avoidance. It keeps people out, then grieves their absence. The danger in avoidance is that it doesn't just impact romantic relationships. It seeps into every area of your life. You avoid hard conversations, so your friendships become shallow. You avoid vulnerability, so your family only knows the version of you that smiles and says everything's okay. You avoid confronting your own pain, so your self-awareness becomes clouded, your emotions repressed. You operate on autopilot, focusing on work, distractions, or surface-level interactions because they feel safe. But safe is not the same as satisfying. Comfortable is not the same as connected. You may look like you have it all together, but internally you're stuck, craving more, yet terrified of what more might require from you. What many avoidants fail to realize is that the cost of avoidance is far greater than the pain they're trying to escape. Yes, vulnerability risks rejection, but avoidance guarantees isolation. Yes, opening up could hurt, but staying closed off will erode your emotional capacity over time. You'll become the person who always feels misunderstood, not because no one cares, but because you've made it impossible for anyone to truly know you. And the longer you stay in this pattern, the deeper the loneliness sinks in. You start to feel disconnected from others, but more tragically, disconnected from yourself. You don't even know how to ask for help because you've convinced yourself you don't deserve it, or that no one will show up if you do. Avoidance isn't a personality trait. It's a coping mechanism that was born from past wounds, maybe from childhood, maybe from heartbreak, maybe from abandonment. Somewhere along the line, you learned that being open got you hurt. So now you protect yourself with silence, sarcasm, distance, or emotional unavailability. But the truth is, that wound won't heal through isolation. It heals when you allow yourself to be seen. Not perfectly, not all at once, but slowly, courageously, piece by piece. You begin to dismantle the narrative that you have to do it all alone. You begin to test the idea that maybe, just maybe, someone can meet you where you are if you'd only let them see where you really are. Avoidance may have kept you safe once, but it's not saving you anymore. It's separating you from every meaningful thing you deeply crave, yet continually run from. The regret is loudest in stillness. Not when you're busy, not when you're surrounded by noise or distractions or movement. It's in the moments when the world gets quiet, when the chaos dies down, when the room empties, when the phone stops ringing, and you're finally alone with your own thoughts, that it creeps in. It doesn't knock. It floods. It comes in waves that echo louder than any external sound could. That's when the memories replay, not like a movie, but like a haunting. You remember the look in their eyes when they were trying to hold on. You hear the softness in their voice when they asked you to open up, when they asked you not to shut them out. You feel the weight of the moments you brushed off, the times you said, "I'm fine," just to avoid going deeper, the times you chose silence over vulnerability. And there, in that stillness, the truth becomes deafening. You didn't just lose someone, you let them go. It's in the stillness that you stop defending yourself. You stop blaming circumstances. Stop reciting the stories you tell yourself to avoid responsibility. You can no longer hide behind, "I didn't know," or "I wasn't ready," or "they were asking too much," because deep down, you did know. You knew they were slipping away. You felt it. You noticed the way they stopped repeating themselves, the way they gave you more space than you asked for, the way they started to smile less around you. But you told yourself they'd stay, that they'd understand, that they'd wait, until one day they didn't. And now, in the stillness, you're left with the aftermath of your own avoidance. You're left with the questions that have no answer. What if I had tried harder? What if I had been more present? What if I had told them what they meant to me before it was too late? In the silence, their absence becomes a presence. You see them in your routine, in the coffee you make for one instead of two, in the songs you skip because they remind you of something you swore you'd never forget, in the places you avoid because the memories there are too vivid. And the regret doesn't always come from one massive failure. It comes from 1,000 small moments, moments where you chose distance over connection, pride over apology, fear over love. It comes from realizing you had something rare, something real, and you didn't protect it. Not because you didn't care, but because you thought you had time. You thought love would be more patient than pain. You thought it would understand your silence forever. But love, no matter how deep, has limits. You begin to see yourself more clearly in the stillness, not through the lens of defense or justification, but through brutal honesty. You weren't the villain, but you also weren't innocent. You were scared, yes, but you let your fear lead. You let your discomfort with vulnerability sabotage the one person who made it safe to be seen. And now that they're gone, you realize how rare that safety was. You realize how uncommonly they loved you, how patiently they waited, how much they gave without asking for much in return, and you begin to ache, not just for them, but for the version of yourself that didn't know how to receive that love when it was being offered so purely. Stillness becomes a mirror. It reflects everything you tried to outrun: the decisions, the silence, the turning away. You try to distract yourself with productivity, with people, with new beginnings. But no matter where you go, regret finds you, because it lives not in your surroundings, but in your chest. It walks beside you. It whispers when the world goes quiet. And in those moments, you don't just regret losing them. You regret not being who they believed you could be. You regret letting your walls speak louder than your heart. You regret not saying the words you felt, not showing the care they needed, not being brave enough to be fully present when it mattered. And maybe the hardest part of regret is that there's no one to apologize to anymore. They're not there to hear the words. The opportunity is gone. The door is closed. And so your apology becomes internal, a quiet acknowledgement that you wish you had done better. You carry that with you, hoping it shapes who you become from here, hoping it teaches you not to shut down, not to assume love will wait indefinitely, not to take someone's presence for granted, because now you know how fast it can slip away. You know what it feels like when the silence around you carries the weight of what you didn't say, didn't do, didn't fight for. And the regret, it doesn't scream, it doesn't rage, it whispers. But in the stillness, that whisper is louder than anything else you've ever heard. Healing isn't a solo mission, no matter how much we romanticize the idea of doing it all alone. The narrative of the lone warrior who climbs out of the darkness with nothing but sheer willpower sounds empowering, but in reality, healing doesn't thrive in isolation. It suffocates. Real healing happens in connection, in community, in safe spaces where you're allowed to fall apart without judgment. We live in a culture that glorifies independence to the point of self-destruction. We applaud people who say, "I don't need anyone," as if that's the highest form of strength. But strength isn't silence. Strength isn't solitude that becomes emotional starvation. Strength is reaching out when your knees buckle. It's allowing someone to sit beside you in your pain. It's choosing to be witnessed, especially when you feel broken. We often confuse self-reliance with resilience. We tell ourselves we can't trust anyone, that no one will understand, that people leave, betray, disappoint. And maybe that's been true. Maybe people have failed you. Maybe you've confided in someone who used your vulnerability against you. Maybe you've depended on someone who wasn't dependable. So you built walls, told yourself you were better off alone, and decided to carry it all by yourself. But healing doesn't ask you to forget what happened. It asks you to soften your grip, to stop clutching pain like a trophy, to release the belief that you're only worthy when you suffer silently. Healing invites you to examine the difference between protecting yourself and isolating yourself, and that line is often thinner than we realize. There's a point in the healing journey where solitude is necessary. Time alone allows clarity. It offers room for reflection, self-exploration, grounding. It's important to hear your own voice without the noise of the world. But the mistake happens when solitude becomes a fortress, when you begin to believe that asking for help is weakness, that admitting you're struggling means you're failing. Healing can begin alone, but it doesn't deepen until you allow others to walk with you. The human nervous system is wired for connection. Safety, calm, and regulation are co-created. That's why a child runs into their parents' arms when they're scared, why a grieving person needs someone to just sit in silence with them, why even as adults we crave someone who simply says, "I see you, I hear you, I'm not leaving." That's not codependency. That's being human. Sometimes we don't let people in because we don't want to burden them. But that's often just a mask for shame. We fear being seen in our rawest form. We fear being too much, too messy, too complicated. And so we isolate, pretending we're healing while secretly unraveling. But healing isn't about being polished or perfect. It's about being honest, about being able to say, "I'm not okay right now," and trusting that someone will still hold your hand, not run from your truth. The people who love you don't expect you to always be strong. They just want to be allowed in. They want to be part of the process, not to fix you, but to remind you that you don't have to carry it all alone. There's a kind of healing that only happens through others. When someone listens without trying to solve you, when someone offers comfort instead of critique, when you're met with compassion instead of correction. Those moments rewire something deep inside. They challenge the belief that you have to be invincible to be loved. They show you that love exists in the messy middle, not just at the finish line of recovery. Being witnessed in your pain is one of the most sacred experiences a human can have. It's not about needing someone to complete you. It's about allowing others to reflect your wholeness back to you, even when you can't see it yourself. Healing is also relational because much of our wounding came through relationships. The betrayal, the abandonment, the neglect, they didn't happen in a vacuum. They were delivered through connection, or the lack of it. And so, it makes sense that deep healing must also happen in relationship. Not just romantic ones, but in friendships, in therapy, in mentorship, in community. In moments where someone looks at you with eyes that say, "You're safe here." In spaces where you can let go of the performance and rest, where you don't have to translate your pain into something palatable, where your healing isn't rushed or judged, but honored. You don't need a stadium of supporters. Sometimes all it takes is one person, one soul who doesn't flinch when you show your wounds, one connection that feels grounding instead of draining, one conversation that feels like a warm blanket on a cold night. Healing happens in those small, sacred exchanges. The text that says, "I'm thinking of you." The voice that says, "Tell me everything." The silence that says, "You don't have to explain." So no, healing isn't a solo mission. It's a shared experience dressed in the illusion of solitude. And the moment you let someone in, even just a little, is the moment healing starts to feel less like survival and more like coming home. Losing them was the mirror, not the punishment. It wasn't the universe being cruel. It wasn't karma or fate out to make you suffer. It wasn't some cosmic retribution designed to break you. It was the moment life handed you the clearest, most honest reflection of yourself, and you couldn't look away. Losing someone who genuinely loved you, who stayed longer than they should have, who tried to reach you through every defense you built, wasn't a punishment. It was the moment the illusion shattered. It was the moment your story about being fine on your own, about not needing anyone, about having everything under control, finally collapsed under the weight of reality. Their absence didn't create your pain. It revealed it. It pulled back the curtain on every avoided conversation, every brushed off emotion, every time you chose pride instead of presence. It exposed the ways you've been living half-heartedly, convinced that connection was optional, that love would always be patient, that the people who truly saw you would always wait. And for a long time, maybe you believed you had more time. You believed they'd understand. You believed love meant never having to explain yourself, never having to be uncomfortable, never having to change. But love doesn't bend forever. It doesn't exist to cushion you from the consequences of your own unhealed patterns. So when they finally walked away, not in anger, not in a storm, but in quiet resignation, you didn't lose a person. You lost the one mirror brave enough to reflect the truth back to you, the truth of your fear, the truth of your emotional absence, the truth that you thought you were protecting yourself when really you were pushing love further and further away. And the irony is, you didn't realize it until they were no longer there to show it to you. In that empty space, the silence became louder than their voice ever was. Their absence taught you more than their presence ever could, not because they weren't enough, but because you weren't ready to meet them in the depth they were offering. And when someone who loves you deeply finally lets go, it doesn't feel like rage. It feels like grief soaked in clarity. It feels like being left with your own echo, surrounded by every "I'm fine" you ever said when you weren't. Haunted by every moment you pulled away when they were reaching for you. You start to realize that you weren't abandoned. You were revealed. And what hurts isn't just that they're gone. It's that now, finally, you see what they were trying to show you all along. The mirror they held up didn't lie. It showed you your patterns, your emotional avoidance, your unspoken fears. It reflected every time you chose control over vulnerability, logic over intimacy, distance over connection. And you resented that mirror because it was easier to believe you were the one being misunderstood, the one being pressured, the one who needed more space. But now, without them, you can no longer project that story outward. You're left to sit with the reality that maybe you weren't ready to receive what they were offering. Not because you didn't want love, but because you didn't know how to trust it. Because somewhere along the way, you learned that being close meant being hurt, that intimacy meant exposure, and that letting someone in meant risking everything. But the mirror doesn't just reflect your damage. It also reflects your potential. It shows you who you could become if you stopped hiding. It shows you what you're capable of if you stop letting fear run the show. Losing them forced you to see yourself in a way you never could when they were still there, trying to help you grow gently. Their love was a soft nudge. Their departure was a hard truth. And you needed both. You needed the warmth of their presence to feel safe enough to start opening, and the cold shock of their absence to realize how often you shut the door. This isn't about punishment. This is about awakening. About being confronted with the reality that you can't keep living behind walls and expect someone to keep knocking forever. It's not just about regret, it's about responsibility. Because once you see the mirror, once you understand how your behaviors contributed to the loss, you can't unsee it. You can't go back to pretending you were powerless, and that's the most painful part, realizing that this wasn't taken from you. It was something you allowed to slip through your fingers, not intentionally, not maliciously, but through inaction, through emotional passivity, through believing love would wait forever while you figured yourself out. And now, every time you look at the empty space they used to fill, you're not looking at punishment. You're looking at your reflection, the version of you that was too afraid to show up, the version of you that has to change if you ever want to hold something that real again. And maybe, just maybe, that reflection is what will finally push you toward becoming the person you were always meant to be.